welcome Sylvia Yee, Vice President of Programs at the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund and BoardSource board member to introduce this panel.
Welcome, everyone. Is this working? Okay. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to our session, The Lasting Impact of Hurricane Katrina on the New Orleans nonprofit community. You are really in for a treat today. As you know, Hurricane Katrina was 10 years ago, and it was the costliest natural disaster and the deadliest hurricane in the history of our country. And like millions of people, I sat in front of my television, frozen, looking with disbelief and horror as this devastation unfolded on the families and this community. Here in New Orleans, the majority of the devastation and the death was caused by nearly 50 breaches in the city's hurricane surge protection system. And eventually, over 80% of the city and large tracts of the neighborhood parishes were underwater and flooded for weeks on end. The response from the New Orleans nonprofit community was simply extraordinary and was profound. And that is their inspiring story that they will be telling today. Our panelists will describe the ways in which the nonprofit and the community leaders came together to defend and rebuild their city, and the lasting impact of those early efforts on the way that the community still works together today, nearly 10 years later. They'll describe the importance of rallying local voices, the impact of working together and collaboration, and the need for nonprofit boards to lead, to be bold, and to take risks. We're so lucky to be meeting here today in New Orleans and to be able to hear firsthand about their experience post-Katrina and the many lessons that this community holds for us as board leaders. And now to get started, I want to introduce a colleague of mine in philanthropy, the CEO and president of the Greater New Orleans Foundation, Albert Rezga.
Thank you. Welcome to all board sourcers. Welcome to the city of mystery, the city of the chefs, the city of festivals, the Paris of the South, the Venice of the Gulf, the Big Easy, the Crescent City, the city that care forgot, the birthplace of jazz, skiddly-ah-wah-wah contact. And that last bit was a little bit of jazz talk, if you didn't catch it. And we just like to call it home, so welcome to our home. And by way of introduction to these three magnificent speakers, I thought I would start by asking you to imagine, and if your imaginations can take you that far, perhaps to experience a few of the forces that help shape this extraordinary place that we call home. Thousands of years ago, we had the fast waters of the Mississippi emptying not into the Gulf of Mexico as they do today, about 80 miles south to our south, but emptying to our north into a basin, to a bay that would one day become Lake Pontchartrain. And many of you flew over Lake Pontchartrain when you were flying into our airport today. I'd like for you to imagine the forces of the transatlantic slave trade, the patterns of European settlement, the building of the first levees, the in-migration of the Cajuns from New Brunswick, from Nova Scotia, from Prince Edward Island, this happened in the late 18th century, and the influx of Haitian emigres in the early 19th century, and the vigorous trade in cotton, tobacco, and sugar, of course, most of it grown by slave labor. In the 1840s, and many people don't know this, in the 1840s, New Orleans was one of the three most populous cities in the United States after New York and Baltimore. And imagine the effect of the Civil War on a city that was really the commercial heart of the Deep South, with over half of all of the cotton grown in the United States passing through the port of New Orleans. And try to imagine, if you can, the shameful era of Jim Crow juxtaposed against the incredible rift in time when, in my view, this country gave to the rest of the world one of its greatest gifts. And I don't know if you know this story, but there was a young man in New Orleans who always seemed to be in trouble with the law, and he was sent to the New Orleans Home for Colored Waifs, many times for general delinquency, and once for a very extended period of time because he shot his stepfather's pistol into the air during a New Year's celebration. And this young man, who was named Louis Daniel Armstrong, found a mentor at the Home for Colored Waifs who provided him a cornet and some musical training. And really, this one act of generosity, this one act of kindness, and I would say of leadership, really changed the world forever. And since we're talking about the forces that shape the city, I'd like you to imagine finally how on August 23rd of 2005, a little more than over 10 years ago, the world paid very little attention to Tropical Depression 12. That was its first name, Tropical Depression 12, as it was forming in the southeast Bahamas. And it was upgraded the very next day to a tropical storm, and it was dubbed Katrina, which ironically means, in Greek, means purity. And what shaped the city of New Orleans since that time has been the heroism of countless people, black, white, brown, who've used all of the means at their disposal to save their neighborhoods, to save their neighbors, and many who lost everything in the floods. And seeing that government at all levels, and we're talking about municipal, state, and federal government, had failed them, took it into their own hands to take action to rebuild their neighborhoods and their lives, and all of our lives in this place we call home, as best they could. We have with us three extraordinary speakers with us today, three household names in New Orleans, three heroes, three local heroes, and national heroes, I would say, and who did their work in New Orleans, obviously, before the storms of 2005, and who've continued to do incredible work since. Immediately to my left is Ann Milling, who's a graduate of Newcomb College, a graduate of Yale University, got your master's at Yale University. She was one of the founders, or the founder of Women of the Storm, and if that sounds frightening, you'll find out how frightening it really was. But she was an incredible activist, obviously before 2005, has been an incredible activist and champion of New Orleans since, and we'll be hearing her story in just a minute. I also wanted to take a moment to introduce Keith Lederman, I should say Dr. Keith Lederman, who has been on the staff of Kingsley House for 20 years and its CEO since 2008? 2003. For those of you who don't know Kingsley House is really one of the premier nonprofit organizations in our city. It was really the first settlement house in the United States.
Deep South.
In the Deep South, the first settlement house in the Deep South. And since it opened its doors in 1896, it served over 500,000 people. And to his left, we have Council Member LaToya Cantrell, who has been serving on the New Orleans City Council since 2012 and had a very distinguished career as a nonprofit executive and as a community activist before that. And she has an extraordinary story to tell us about pure grit and green dots, and we'll get to unravel that mystery in just a few minutes. All of these speakers have extraordinary stories to tell us this morning. As I said, they're all heroes to us. And I'm going to start with you, Anne. I'm going to ask you about, really, we commemorated the 10th anniversary of Katrina just a few months ago. And for many New Orleanians up to that point, and still today you hear us measuring time as being pre-K and post-K. And I'm wondering if you can take us back a little bit and tell us what it was like at that time.
Thank you, Albert.
Yeah.
Indeed, my pleasure. And I want to also extend a welcome to all of you. We just love it when organizations and groups like you choose New Orleans as the venue for your meetings. We love to showcase our rebuilt city, and which is just shiny and beautiful, and we always think that 10 years later, you know, we're experiencing a renaissance. So I hope you enjoy every minute that you are here in our city. But I am going to turn the clock back 10 years to August 29th, 2005. And Hurricane Katrina did blow in, and it was just barely a Category 3 storm. And it wasn't this natural storm, as you heard earlier, that caused the problems. It was a man-made disaster, which we have to keep reminding ourselves. The levees breached and breached and breached, and the waters came and poured in, and the water stayed. It wasn't like the Gulf Coast or the Florida coast where the water swishes in and it goes out. Here, we're like we've said earlier, it's a soup bowl. And as you mentioned earlier, 80% of the city was underwater, if you can believe it. You can see it right there. At this time, 80%. 220,000 homes and businesses were shuttered by this storm, which is just mind-boggling to think of it. 1,800 people died with this storm. And the one fact my husband insists that I tell everybody, because it's a positive in this negative situation, is that 1.3 million people were evacuated from the metropolitan area. And that really was a positive accomplishment at that time. But think about this, because the water stayed and stayed and stayed. And as you can imagine, the mildew came and everything happened. And people like all of us here on the stage today didn't get back I didn't come back till the beginning of November. And when I did tiptoe back into the city, it's hard for you to imagine, but there was very little electricity, no postal stations, no grocery stores, no anything. And it was quite eerie. And as I think maybe Albert said, government at all levels failed us. City, state, the federal government failed New Orleanians at that time, and we became more frustrated. And because of that, that's why people began to take things into their own hand. People became empowered. Grassroots organizations mushroomed up. The very first one I remember when I got back in the beginning of November, this precious young girl started the Katrina crew. And what she did was she organized people to pick up debris, if you can imagine that. I mean, the city was covered in debris in a more organized fashion. LaToya, who's also a woman of the storm, she too was working in her neighborhood, Broadmoor, which you're going to hear more about. Another friend of mine who was so undone by what happened with the levee breaches started Citizens for One of Greater New Orleans. And that had the focus of the state trying to revamp our levee board system. It was just dismal. So, I mean, people were taking slices of the pie, and it was truly grassroots endeavors because there was a void, a true void in this city. And for some unknown reason, I cannot tell you, in December, I became aware of the fact of the lack of attention from the federal government. Truly, in December, at the end of December '05, listen to this, 12 senators out of a body of 100 had been to see the devastation. And in that 12, I'm counting the 2 from Louisiana, 2 from Mississippi, 2 from Alabama, so doesn't leave much that came down here. Also, I became aware at that time, out of a body of 435 members of the House, this is a civics lesson for you, only 25 had come here. And again, I'm including our very own members of the House who had visited the biggest disaster in our history. So in January, got through the holiday, it was all kind of pretty grim. I decided for some unknown reason to invite about 8 girls to come to the house and hear this idea. I had this idea that why don't we go and invite the Congress to come to New Orleans and see it. Our contention repeatedly was you had to see the devastation. Newspaper photos, television clips really didn't tell the story of what had happened here. So these women came to my home, and I had said, it may be the shortest meeting you've ever attended, but here's my idea. And each of these gals were not particularly close friends of mine. They were younger than I was smart enough to get young, energetic women, but each had a proven track record as a volunteer. They had worked in the fields of education, the arts, and whatever. And each of these women, when you gave them a job or responsibility or head of an organization, they performed well. And so I had great respect for all of them. And when they came on January 10th, 2006, they said, let's go to Washington. Let's do it. And I went, oh my God, what are we going to do? Well, let me tell you what we did in 20 days. This is volunteerism, activism, whatever you want to call it, on steroids. In 20 days, we came up with the name, Women of the Storm. We had the pin that we got. One of the women suggested that we have an umbrella, and we said nothing fluffy. And so it looked like blue tarp, like the rooftops of the city. It's a blue tarp umbrella. We raised the money in 20 days to charter a plane of 140 to go to Washington for the day. And then what we did, and I think would interest all of you who serve on boards, and something I feel very strongly about, is that we went about filling the plane. And we weren't going to fill it with my neighbors up and down the street. We could do that with great ease. We were determined that this was going to be a diverse group of women. Women, Hispanics, Vietnamese, African American, Caucasian, old, young, working women, stay-at-home moms, different socioeconomic backgrounds. We wanted this plane load of women to reflect our community, the metropolitan area, and even invited some of the women from South Louisiana to come. And I really have to say this, and I can't underscore it enough, that in anything that I try to do, and I know all of you on your boards, this is a critical component, is to have the diversity to reflect the community. And what we did was we paired them on this trip, and on every trip consequently. We gave them, we articulated our mission, and again, going to you in boardsmanship, you have to know your mission, you have to know your goals and objectives. Our mission was to knock on the door of every member of Congress, invite them to come to New Orleans to see the devastation, and that we needed three things. We needed dollars to rebuild our nests. Our homes had been destroyed. We needed, and what good would it be to rebuild your home if something comes along and again you're going to flood? We needed money to repair the infrastructure, the pumps, the levees, all of that. And the third thing we recognized that we needed money to rebuild our coast. For the first time, everyone was aware that the coast of Louisiana, which is the speed bump when a hurricane comes, had to be rebuilt. It slows down the hurricane and the velocity, and ours was washing away. So this was our mission when we went to Washington. And there we were, our first press conference, 2006. God was good, and I have to tell you, everything was working in our favor. It was a slow news day in Washington. So, and I'm being very honest. I'm telling you what, I didn't know anything of what I was getting into. And here we were. Every media in America, it seemed, came to our press conference. It was as though we were in the Rose Garden with the president, and because they had nothing else to do. And they were charmed, positively charmed by these women who were well-dressed, educated, they knew what they were after. You just couldn't have asked for a better group or a better day. And because of the fact that the media just kept repeating it, CNN must have played our story 1,000 times. When we knocked on the doors in Congress, who they all watch television all day long, they knew. It's true. They knew who we were. Right, LaToya? LaToya will verify that. They knew who we were. And truthfully, you all, it was just extraordinary to be able to knock on those doors and invite them to come. And here's another shot of another time that we were there. And on that day, January 30th, 2006, I think the turning point for me and for so many was Nancy Pelosi was the leader of Congress as she is today. And I'll never forget it as long as I live. She shook my hand and she said, I promise I will go across the hall to Dennis Hastert, the speaker, and we will bring a Codell, which is a congressional delegation, to New Orleans. And I believed her. And indeed, she did exactly that. And just about 6 weeks later, the largest Codell in the history of Congress came to New Orleans. And we, the Women of the Storm, hosted this. We gave them tours. We took them block by block, mile by mile to see the devastation. And once they saw it, they became our advocate. We also set up meetings with civic and business leaders, not politicians. We kind of kept it out of the realm of the political because they'd been a dismal failure. And The civic and business community responded. They met with everybody we brought. After the House members came, it became quite chic to come to New Orleans and do this. I mean, we had everybody from the Senate side began to start coming one after another, and that's how we gained the support. The Women of the Storm continued to go back. I'm going to show you a shot with Nancy, back to Washington repeatedly that year, full plane loads in September. We went back in small groups at the end of '06. Indeed, Congress did give us the $10.5 billion for our road home, which was to build our homes. They did give us money to rebuild the infrastructure, and they gave us just a smidge of money from the outer continental shelf oil and gas drilling that never goes to Louisiana, it goes straight into the national coffers. First time at the end of '06, they passed this Go Mesa bill, and they said in 2017, which seemed like a long way away, we would begin to get a little fraction of the revenue. But it was a beginning, and it is a beginning. And the Women of the Storm continued to do their thing. We kept trying to get a presidential debate. We kept pounding about coastal restoration. And in 2010, of course, the BP oil spill came, and we were poised, ready to act again. And this time, just so you'll understand, we recognized that the scope of the BP oil spill was the whole Gulf Coast. So what we did is we invited women from Florida to Texas to join us. And again, we filled that charter plane, went back to Washington to fight for the Restore Act and to urge Congress to give the dollars from the Clean Water Act back to the Gulf Coast for restoration. And indeed, that happened in 2012. So it's been a wonderful, wonderful adventure. We're not through yet. We still have to watch where this money is spent. But I have to tell all of you as trustees and members from your communities that the voice of the people is so vital and so important. And when there is a void in the system, and there was truly a void, the people will step forward and they will make the right decisions and lead the community. And that's what's happened in New Orleans. And indeed, we've been very blessed for all the hundreds and thousands of those who have participated in our Renaissance. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I just want to say that Anne is really a typical New Orleans board member. That's how strong the community is here. Keith, there were so many needs in New Orleans before the storms in 2005, and so many disparities that persist to this day. And what was it like? I'm going to ask you, after we get your slides up.
Get my PowerPoint.
We are experiencing technical difficulties.
Okay, great.
There we go.
So let's give Anne another big hand, by the way.
Lord, no.
She's talk about phenomenal individuals. And you know, for those of you in the room who might have a social work background or an economics background, what Anne just presented was very much at the macro level for what needs to happen after a disaster. When people in our community organize, advocate, lobby, and really go to bat for all of us who, in very large part, we're kind of in the trenches, the kind of voice of the voiceless for our community, and which really led to remarkable results on the federal level, most especially on the state level, and a recovery that had really, as Ann mentioned, had been so lagging on all fronts in the public sector that it was extremely frustrating for those of us on the ground. So thank you, Ann, for all that you've done. And the Women of the Storm, phenomenal group, and I feel really fortunate to know a whole bunch of those ladies who have just done so much for our community. So I'm going to give you more of like the macro levels, the micro levels. So what was happening on the ground for an individual social and human service organization, as Albert mentioned earlier, I'm the CEO of Kingsley House, established in 1896. We've been around for a long time. We were about, do the math, we're about 110 years old at the time of Katrina. I had been at Kingsley House at that time for about 11 years, 2 years at the helm of the organization. And I kind of felt at the time like I had this whole thing down. I know how to be a CEO, work effectively with my board of directors and the community, and I was kind of feeling like I was coasting in my role. Things were going really, really well. And then on August 29th, everything changed. So Ann mentioned a few of the statistics. And so first I thought I'd just kind of share with y'all what we were faced with as a community at that time. So like Ann mentioned, in the Southeast Louisiana metropolitan area, we were looking at the resettlement of a little bit more than 1.5 million people. People who were dispersed, displaced all over the map of the country. And we had over 430,000 homes that had been damaged and more than 200,000 totally destroyed or severely damaged. And again, just by way of, and I'm sure y'all are familiar with the numbers, but 90,000 square miles of damaged area affected by the storm. In New Orleans, in particular, we were looking at 180,000 of our 200,000 homes were destroyed or completely uninhabitable. And then 80% of our city flooded, like Ann mentioned. So just to give a sense of what 80% of a city like New Orleans is, 180 square miles. New Orleans' total square miles is about 350, I think, and half of it's water. So just about every habitable square mile took on flooding in the city, except for that small little sliver by the river that we affectionately refer to it as. But again, to give a sense of proportion, think of how many have been to Manhattan? Raise your hand if you've been to Manhattan. So most everybody's been to Manhattan. 7 times the size of the island of Manhattan for New Orleans, 180 square miles. That's what it looks like. So picture how big Manhattan is. 7 times that size took on flooding, anywhere from 1 to 12 to 20 feet of water. And over, it's interesting because, we're here all about the not-for-profit sector. And a lot of times, I think those of us in the not-for-profit world and society in general takes us for granted, that we're always here, we're always the safety net. Well, as a result of Katrina, 80% of our sector was basically down for the count. Some temporarily, many permanently, and did not come back, did not recover. And we've had a lot of resurgence since that time. But that's what we're looking at, that's what we're faced with in the immediate aftermath of Katrina. We were also faced with this period of time called displacement. If you've never been displaced, I don't recommend it. It's not a nice place to be, especially when you're displaced and you're not quite sure how long this is gonna last, and then when you come back, what it's gonna look like, what's gonna be the case. So for New Orleans in particular, though, that period of displacement, at least for businesses in New Orleans, lasted for a little bit more than a month. So the city, and picture this, the biggest city in your state, the most significant economic city in your state, and imagine that it's completely closed down for more than a month. That you can't, even if you could get there, you were not granted entry back into the city unless you were a first responder or an emergency worker or somebody who was working for the city or for the state or the federal government or FEMA. So completely shut down. So at Kingsley House, my staff and my board were displaced all over the map. More than 10 states, many, many cities, 110 staff, and about 30 board members at that time. And we were everywhere. I was in Atlanta for about 5 weeks with my family, and people were all over the map. So one of the things that was interesting for me in this journey was my first reaction after the storm, and when we started the process of displacement, and as well, I was fortunate that I was able to connect up with my senior staff within 24 hours of evacuating. We really felt that we didn't know how long this period was going to last, how long not being able to come home was going to last, but we felt this very strong commitment that we needed to do whatever we had to help keep our staff whole through this process as much as we could. So where's board leadership come into all this? Within pretty short order, about a couple of days after the storm, I was able to connect with our board president at Kingsley House and with most of the members of the board executive committee, which was great. and extremely important. It was important because, like I mentioned, I wanted to try to keep our staff whole, and I was immediately authorized at that point that no matter how long this lasts, for as long as we can do it, I could keep staff on full payroll, full benefits. We had to find everybody. Took a little bit of time, about a week, to find where everybody was throughout the country. But that ended up being 3 payrolls over 6 weeks to the tune of about $110,000 payroll. And then add benefits onto it, it was about $500,000 within that first 6 weeks following Katrina. So this was, again, remember, at a time when we had virtually no operations for that 6-week period. Our funding fell from $430,000 in monthly revenues to $35,000 in monthly revenues overnight, just like that. Most of our funders either suspended on a temporary basis, froze, or just permanently ceased funding for operations because, again, nobody knew what was going to happen, if anything was going to come back, if anybody was ever going to come back, and what the situation in New Orleans was going to be. And that gets a little bit more significant a little bit later on in my presentation. We, during that 6-week period of time, exhausted our operating surplus. We had spent a long time building up a healthy operating surplus, gone. And we also started to withdraw from our reserve funds. Remember those rainy day funds? Yeah, so we started taking out from there. And we reached, as an organization, a record high deficit for our 110 years. So that's kind of what we were looking at within 6 weeks after the storm. So the agency also took on a lot of damages, and we're a historic agency. It's kind of like if you've ever been to, and I know a number of you in the room have been at Kingsley House, it looks kind of like a small college campus. But half of our 4-acre facility took on severe damages, about 40,000 square feet of working space that we couldn't occupy, and it was a little bit more than $4 million in damages when all was said and done. So the board, though, I came back on September 29th when we were first allowed back into the city as businesses to kind of take a look at, survey the damage. And I met with our insurance agent, I met with our architect who we'd worked with for a long time, and a local contractor that we'd also been involved with for a pretty good period of time prior to Katrina. And they said, look, you know, you've got an opportunity here we can start work. We don't know what insurance is going to settle it. We don't know any of how this is all going to play itself out. But if you can get authorization to move forward with getting a local contractor and who can bring in an out-of-state sub, we'd strongly recommend that you do that. So I called the board, and on that day was able to get authorization to do that. Again, knowing that we had already assumed a huge loss post-Katrina, and our board took the risk, took on that challenge. They felt it was important. They agreed with me that we needed to move forward, knowing that it could add even more debt. And what this resulted in within a couple of short months following the storm was Kingsley House became the Gulf Coast's very first resettlement and recovery center, helping as families and individuals were starting to return to the city. And we also became the first child care center and senior center in the city to reopen following the storm in late November of 2005. Important assets and resources as folks were coming back. But there was more to the story in terms of risk. So also on September 29th, a group of us, United Way and United Way's Community Impact Partners, met in the city of Hammond, about an hour from New Orleans. It's the closest we could get for a meeting point. And anybody who could come back, came back. And we were trying to figure out, well, what in the heck are we going to do? So we gathered with 4 other of the largest social and human service organizations here in the greater New Orleans area. And we said, you know, we're all in the same boat here. We had lost facilities, we had lost financial support, our funding plummeted, most of us 90% plus, and we didn't know when our staff were going to be able to come back and if they were going to be able to come back at all. And so we determined that we needed to pool our scarce financial, personnel, human resources, and physical resources if we were going to have any chance at all at helping to meet the needs of our recovering community. And so then we all conferred with our boards of directors, and again, we're fortunate that we had boards that recognized that we needed to take the plunge here and to go all in. And it created what we called the Community-Based Services Network. We partnered with the then newly formed Louisiana Recovery Authority and a local foundation, and over a 2-year period, met the recovery needs of tens of thousands of people throughout the region and households. And we established, Ann mentioned models that got replicated from what Women of the Storm did after the storm. Our model for recovery in the community-based services network was also replicated following Hurricane Gustav in 2008, and then again after the BP oil spill crisis for partnering, pooling resources to meet needs of the community. But at the time, back in 2005, again, this required a huge leap of faith on the part of our boards and our board at Kingsley House to go all in. We had never done anything like that before, anything even remotely close to looking like going all in. But I feel really strongly that these kinds of unprecedented crises really call for equally unprecedented risk-taking. And it's really led to some permanent paradigm shifts for us at Kingsley House following Katrina. We now have much more assertive when it comes to strategic risk-taking as an organization. We aggressively pursue opportunities to grow our high-impact programs, to get them much more to scale, to meet community needs and the big challenges that we have in our community. And we also significantly invest in our infrastructure to support our programs and maximize that impact that we're able to have on our community. So a couple of lessons learned before I conclude. One is we've got to take risks to meet needs. We've got to do this. We need board leaders who are comfortable with risk-taking and who have some experience at taking risk. And it falls within their wheelhouse. Critically important to have board leadership like that. We have to use our reserves as organizations. If your organization has reserves, don't just wait, keep them for the rainy day fund or for the crisis when it happens. Invest in your programs, invest in positioning your agency for the kind of strategic growth that's necessary to meet the needs of your community. And we've got to aggressively pursue strategic growth and partnering in order to get to scale quicker. That was definitely a positive post-Katrina. One of the silver linings, we saw how effective it was when we partner and bring together resources. So I have a couple of quick examples. We got a huge need for early learning here in New Orleans for how we took on greater risk. In 2010, we opened our second preschool location in 100 years. We franchised. And this was unprecedented public and private partnership for Kingsley House. Then in 2013, we actually purchased property for the first time in our history. Before then, every single parcel of property we had was donated to the agency. And we took on debt in order to buy that property and also develop it into another 25,000 square feet of operating space for more infant and toddler classrooms, $2.5 million of debt for a $10.5 million project. First time we've ever taken on debt. And then in 2015, we became a Head Start grantee after doing 50 years of Head Start, and we were able to double our capacity by partnering with 10 other partner agencies, child care providers across the region, in order to expand our capacity. So just a quick epilogue. Nonprofits rock, people. We are the bomb. I have no doubt about it. We were the hidden heroes behind this storm as a sector when the public sector was virtually frozen, didn't know what in the heck to do. Faith-based, community-based nonprofits took the lead. Civic leadership came to the fore and really helped to meet the needs of our community. And we can't change the world as not-for-profits. I have no doubt about that as well. But we can't be risk averse. We've got to increase our risk tolerance threshold. Otherwise, we risk not being able to accomplish our missions. So our communities, though, are in crisis. And I think everybody can agree at varying levels throughout the country. So we have to be bold. We have to be willing to take risks to have the greatest impact and make our world a better place for everyone. Thank you all so much.
It's hard to find a better use of rainy day funds. Adds new meaning to the term. Councilmember Cantrell, you have had a distinguished public service career, but your name is also closely associated with one of our great neighborhoods in New Orleans, Broadmoor. And unfortunately, many who only visit for a few days will see the French Quarter, they'll see the Garden District, but they really won't get a chance to visit Broadmoor. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what it's like today and your story and your connection with that.
Okay, well, and I'll be brief. I know we've taken up a lot of time. Again, welcome to the City of New Orleans, and thank you for being here for this very important panel. I don't know how I moved from the first slide, but I have no idea. But I did want to take you at least back to, okay, I'll stick with this one, that's fine, whoever's controlling it. This is a map of the Broadmoor community, the neighborhood that I was the leader of as just a neighborhood organization, the Broadmoor Improvement Association. I took on that role in the pre-Katrina environment. I moved into this neighborhood in 1999. First house, was able to purchase it, meaning that we could afford, my husband and I. And it's just keep moving. I want to just kind of get you geographically in touch with the fabric that I'm talking about. But at any rate, the City of New Orleans has 73 neighborhoods, and Broadmoor is one of them. It's right there in the center with that little circle, green circle around. It's centrally located in the heart of this city. It's about 7 minutes from where we are now. But much happened in recommendations that came out of this post-Katrina planning. So there were 7 neighborhoods that were recommended to the mayor at the time not be rebuilt post-Katrina. Well, one of those neighborhoods was mine in Broadmoor. It's considered lower lining. Of course, we're all below sea level, but it was where the water came up, and it stayed for 3+ weeks. So it didn't rush in, it just came up. We took on about 6 to 12 feet of water. Broadmoor was home to 7,232 residents. Population in terms of demographics, 68% African American, 25% Caucasian, about 3% Latina at the time, 0.6% Asian. Very, very diverse community. Doctors, lawyers, Indian chiefs, people earning from $13,000 a year to $400,000 a year. Poverty rate right at 32%, again, mirroring the city of New Orleans demographically and social economically. And so we were told, hey, your homes will be mowed down, you will become a drainage park. We were not consulted, but this group of folks from somewhere made this recommendation. And so I'm quoted as to saying all hell broke loose. Well, it did, because we felt that we were viable. The recommendations in this Bring Back New Orleans Commission's plan, when you read through the back as to how they determined which neighborhoods would come back or not, they said, okay, oh, walkability. We want to make sure neighborhoods are walkable. Oh, historic fabrics. Oh, great. Well, Broadmoor is a National Historic District, touting 5 different architectural styles, home to the majority of raised basement properties when this neighborhood was formed and developed in 1905 through 1920. So we felt like, hey, everything that they were talking about to save a community, we saw ourselves in that. So we turned it around on them. I was displaced in Houston. Of course, like Keith mentioned, board members all everywhere. We were able to make some form of contact. But while we were displaced, we did have folks living in their raised basement homes in Broadmoor. So they were pretty much the second levels, the main, your main living quarters, so to speak. So I would get calls from some of the residents when they heard front page of newspaper, that's when they saw the big green dot over their community. So I would get calls, wait a minute, we want to rally, Broadmoor lives, Broadmoor lives. I said, okay. Turned out to be the same day they wanted to rally was the day that I was scheduling our first community meeting. So what we have to do as board leaders, right? You build on momentum. You build on the momentum from the ground. You don't say, oh, well, we were going to do our meeting, so later for that. No. You build it how it comes. And from the ground, you can never go wrong. So what I did, I said, okay, good. We're going to rally, Broadmoor lives. and we'll use that as an opportunity to get the word out to the community to where Broadmoor was coming back, but not only that, when we would have our first neighborhood meeting. So we had over 300 people participate in this rally. The next week was the general meeting. We had 600 people at that meeting, and then we began to plan for ourselves. One, we took the vote of, hey, this wasn't about a certain section of Broadmoor being the green dot. When I mentioned to you that 32% of poverty rate, you have to imagine that was in a certain section of the neighborhood. Census Tract 103 to give it to you straight, which is a census tract identified by the federal government as being in need of additional resources. So instead of saying, hey, let this area be the green dot, we can reimagine Broadmoor, and hey, we won't have to deal with poverty anymore. But the community overwhelmingly said, hey, we want everyone to have the right to return. And more importantly, I lived in that Census Tract 103, and like hell, I was going to be representing the neighborhood who voted to say that our fabric wasn't coming back. But what that really meant at the time was that I've told you that I was leading this community pre-Katrina. 2 weeks before Katrina hit, I had a board meeting. I asked my board, hey, can you give me a little money so we can support our local public school, welcoming the teachers back to Broadmoor, teaching our kids, and school was about to start. They said no. Well, I hustled it up on my own, had the luncheon for our teachers. I'm just giving you that backdrop. 2 weeks later, Katrina hits. Again, not really having the masses on the front end. Once Katrina hit, everyone felt the level of devastation. Everyone was engaged, wanting to make sure that Broadmoor returned. So for me, it felt like a horrible opportunity as I was trying to get people to give a damn about public education pre-Katrina. Didn't have to work so hard in that post-Katrina environment. So it was the real opportunity to make people focus on not only themselves, but the community as a whole and where the needs were the greatest pre-Katrina. Slumlords, blighted property, low-performing school, mediocre library, you name it, crime, drug trafficking, that sort of thing. So this was a real opportunity when people stood up and said all of Broadmoor and everyone had the right to return, we hit the ground with planning for ourselves. As Ann mentioned, government failed us on every level, absolutely, absolutely. And so we were challenged with planning for ourselves, but it was the best thing that could have happened. Now, this city went through a total of 3 different planning processes. And Broadmoor's redevelopment plan culminated into hours and hours of meetings. We subdivided the community into subgroups A, B, and C. We did that purposefully because each part of the neighborhood was different. And everyone's experience where they live was different. So their input as to how they wanted the neighborhood to be rebuilt better was targeted. And so we would all meet with the same topic, example, education. Come back as a community to say, okay, what did we learn as a community? What do we all want? But what it taught us was that we all wanted the same thing. We wanted our school to be better than it was before. We wanted the housing to be better than it was before. We wanted to get rid of blight, get rid of those slumlords. We wanted to make sure that flood mitigation was a priority for the community. Raising homes, meaning above the Katrina line. LEED certified in terms of environmentals. All of those things were embedded in this redevelopment plan that was adopted in its entirety in every planning process that the city went through, from the city council's plan to the Unified New Orleans plan to the Louisiana Recovery Authority's plan. The neighborhood of Broadmoor's plan was adopted and was implemented in its entirety by the community, but in partnership. One thing we learned early on, you cannot do it by yourselves. And it was the nonprofit community that was there for us. So we were a nonprofit neighborhood organization, 501c3 since 1972, but it was the nonprofit community abroad that we could depend on to help us. So, and I'm looking at, I see Don Phoenix is in here, James Ross, NeighborWorks America, boots on the ground. I remember meeting with them in a double-wide trailer in the heart of our neighborhood, you know, months after, as to how they could help. Government, biggest pockets in town, of course, they were a partner 5 years later, but in the front end, it was your private community, nonprofits, it was your faith-based organizations, volunteers, universities, colleges, and of course, the people themselves. And so from this plan, so now, 10 years later, Broadmoor was able to, oh, this is huge, and it goes to that key map in terms of impact. So we were able to make sure that our public school came back in its entirety when we were told, no, public education, school's not coming back. We said, oh, like hell, it's not. We gutted it ourselves. We gutted it ourselves. The week after we gutted it, here comes FEMA. And I'm like, well, what you need to do? We gutted our school. We held all of the things that we felt that we can salvage. We stored them in the library. Well, when FEMA showed up, guess what? They cleared out the library. So everything we felt that we can save, they took. That's okay. But today rests a $29 million new construction and historic restoration of our public school, which serves 600 kids a day, pre-K to 8th grade. It's coming back better really than it was before, little bumps and bruises along the way. But it took the community to say, our school is important. It took the community to say, we're going to raise resources to make sure it comes back. And so we became that voice. And that school today is Andrew H. Wilson Charter School. We had to charter the school because we weren't on this magical list that the state came up with. So the only way we could bring back public ed was to charter it. So these are some of the things that we had to deal with 10 years ago. And you may say, well, now New Orleans really does have a system of schools. We have the majority charter school system in the country right now. And largely because at a time when decisions were being made, people were being left out of those decisions. And we had to push forward and push through to ensure that we got public ed back. So it is back in the heart of the Broadmoor neighborhood. Andrew H. Wilson, I mentioned that because he was the first juvenile court judge in the city that sentenced Louis Armstrong to the Colored Waves house. Matters, it all matters. In addition to the library, we were thinking about all of our federal money, all of our private money, focusing that money in a centralized area of Broadmoor, which ended up being that Census Tract 103. The school was in 103. The public library, again, in Census Tract 103. The community raised $2.3 million privately to bring back its public library, but bring it back as a library and a community center, servicing thousands a week, programming out of the wazoo, even a Green Dot Cafe, serving Starbucks coffee. It's a big deal. And so, but Carnegie Corporation of New York, one of our partners, had not given money to build a library since the early 1900s, but they gave us $2 million for that. The Clinton Global Initiative was a partner of ours as well, Shell Oil, I mentioned NeighborWorks. The list literally goes on and on and on. The Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, who sent interns to us, that's still doing it to this day, but Shell gave us about $750,000 that funded this robust internship program that helped us implement our redevelopment plan. They didn't write it for us, we wrote it ourselves, but what they did was do the research to tell us what does an urban plan look like. Because when we wanted it to be implemented and adopted, we wanted folks, those decision makers, to see that it was credible and that we knew what it would take, and we were the world's greatest experts on our community. In addition to the library, it's an arts and wellness center we just opened in June of this year. Behavioral health, which we started in the neighborhood 6 years ago, because again, mental health services, you couldn't find them. So as a community, we had to figure out what could we do to help our people. So we hired a licensed clinical social worker, Then we partnered with Tulane School of Social Work, and the community would get 3 graduate students a year. They had to do a year to get their license. So as long as you had a supervision with a licensed clinical social worker, you were in, and that is still going on to this very day. Followed by a community health clinic. We raised millions to get that online. It's servicing the neighborhood now. And in addition to that is really the $53 million of housing that we were able to also build in the community, leverage. When you leverage all of these different resources together, you really get that big impact that I'm speaking of. So the challenge for the community right now is to ensure that the entire neighborhood is back better than it was before. It's really exceeding, I would say, our goals as it relates to that. We still have about 170 blighted properties in the neighborhood, but there's a real strategic plan that the leadership now is working from to make sure that we address these issues. Of course, I still live in Broadmoor. My work in the community really kind of led me to running for office with the city council, and you would even think the work that I'm speaking of, that support would be lined up to even help neighborhood leadership be elected in this post-Katrina environment. Well, it was not, but that's all good because the people, see where we started, I'm only saying it because when you're dealing at the grassroots level, the people who are really making the decisions that will lead the community, city to the future are still continuing to make those decisions as it looks to its government. So this is a big deal for the city of New Orleans because it's playing out the way that the people intended to. They're being engaged, more engaged than ever before. They're showing up and they're letting their voices be heard, in which we need to make sure we maintain that level of involvement with our communities and our neighborhoods. I also wanted to say in this post-Katrina environment, what we're looking at as well is looking very closely at affordable housing as we look forward, right? So ensuring that neighborhoods are coming back, but looking for that balance. And as the renaissance is happening, as Ann mentioned, making sure that people who lived in these communities pre-Katrina will enjoy the renaissance in the post-Katrina environment. So these are some of the things as a council person that I'm looking to and looking towards, but it is through the voice of the nonprofit communities and leaders, because you all get it. You're on the ground, and you get it in ways that really sometimes government does not. So I'm just urging you to continue to stay engaged, continue to groom, bring on new leadership. Don't be afraid to take those risks that Keith talked about, because as the leadership in my community has changed, I'm no longer on the board. I tried to groom leadership to stay in place. I forgot to mention, as a community, we did establish a neighborhood improvement district, basically that we're taxing ourselves $100 a year to bring in resources on an annual basis so the community could keep progress going. Because as you move further from disaster, resources diminish. And we as a neighborhood wanted to show people that we have skin in the game. So not just always, hand out, but how we can demonstrate that we're helping ourselves. So that 5-year parcel fee is up November 21. So it will be a real referendum. It'll be interesting to see if the community will re-up their commitment to a long-term sustainability plan and initiative. I think we're going to take questions.
We might
We
have
might,
time, yeah.
but thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for being here.
It's such an incredible story, and I have to say, Council Member Cantrell is one of the less forceful members of our city council. That's how it goes here. That's how we roll in New Orleans. Thank you so much for that. And the reference to the green dots, those of you who don't know the story, is that the green dotted, there was a map of the city, and neighborhoods that were slated to be kind of wiped out or wiped off the map had these green dots put on them. That's why this,
Green space.
Green
They were gonna be
space.
parks.
they were
They
going to
would be
become
parks,
green space, right? And so that's why this having a green dot cafe is such a wonderful poke in the eye.
It sure is, and one of the things that we've learned, those neighborhoods that had that threat, they're rocking and rolling.
Yeah.
They really are. The threat meant something, and it meant as a community that we had to stand up for what we knew was a great place to live, work, worship, attend school, and programming.
We had so much wonderful community activism, civic leaders, and these are civic leaders, many of them not necessarily working in the context of a nonprofit organization. So these are civic leaders of the nonprofit organizations came later. And as Keith mentioned, there were so many nonprofits, not-for-profits that just didn't survive the storm. I did want to ask any member of the panel just one question about obviously there are some organizations that weathered the storm. They may have had better financial resources. Could you talk a little bit about the role of leadership? How does it correlate? How does leadership correlate with those nonprofits that were able to weather the storm? And what were the characteristics of that leadership? What were some of the things that leaders had to do in order to adjust to this incredible change in circumstances? And Keith or Ann or LaToya?
Well, I think Keith kind of summed it up. You know, our ability and your ability to take risks and make decisions quickly in a time where you don't have a lot of time. And the people that you serve, they need you on the ground, making those decisions and getting things done. In the post-Katrina, but really pre-Katrina in terms of our nonprofit environment, we really didn't have, we had a lot, but we didn't have them doing the best of the work. And so in the post-Katrina environment, it was a real challenge to either start up a new organization so you could kind of separate yourselves from the bad ones, or those that did survive in that environment were really doing great work pre-Katrina anyway. So it's the leadership that you're speaking about that did not waver when disaster happened.
Ann?
I'd like to say I served on a variety of boards back then, and what I noticed was that first, of course, the board had to be really passionate and committed to the organization. That was number one, because at this time, everybody was stretching for many, many reasons. And secondly, what I noticed on a number of boards that did survive is that the board came together and they reassessed what was realistic, what could they accomplish. They looked at their plans, whatever it might be, 3 to 5 year plans, and everybody had to just be more realistic in resources and what could and mission and what could be accomplished. So I think there was a lot of soul searching and reflection on what we were about, whatever it was, whether it was, you know, with Kingsley House, or whether it was Second Harvesters Food Bank and the needs that they had, or the museum, the things that I was involved with. Everybody looked inward to see how can we plan more thoughtfully, more realistically, with the resources that we had, because they did diminish. Everybody's resources diminished.
Yeah, and I think too, you know, a lot of it goes back to what was happening before the storm, like LaToya was saying. You know, just one example. So at Kingsley House, we, about 10 years before Katrina, our insurance agent met with our board leadership, met with our staff leadership team, and said, you know, you guys are way underinsured for your property. You guys do great work, but you're sitting on this pretty valuable piece of property right here in the Garden District, and if something happens, you're not covered for a whole lot of property, contents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We know you want to do good work. That's important, and you've always pulled all your money into doing the work. But our board really took that to heart at that point. And so we started incrementally adding to our coverages every year from that point forward. And again, remember, 10 years pre-Katrina. By June 2005, for the first time ever, we were fully insured for property, contents, added business interruption coverage, and then 3 months later, the storm happened. So that $4 million of damages, by the way, fully covered. We didn't pay a dime out of pocket. FEMA success story, covered our deductibles. FEMA covered our deductibles. It was great. So, but again, it's preparation. It's what you do before that I think separates what happens after an unfortunate or horrific disaster like that happens.
And also, I assume a great deal of improvisation. This is something we learned from our jazz masters here in New Orleans.
Yeah, right.
As I guess in this case, your board manual goes out the window, perhaps, or at least half of it does. You have to improvise.
And the strategic management plan.
No, it's true. We used to say, you need to be flexible. Be flexible. And we were like, no, you need to be fluid because flexible is still too rigid,
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's good. So true.
We have a little bit of time to take one or two questions from the audience, and I'll repeat the question because I'm not sure we have, we're getting a microphone here. But would anybody like to ask a question for one of our panelists? Please raise your hand. I can't see the hands. We have one back here. Yep.
What was philanthropy like 3 years after, 5 years after, and now 10 years after? I mean, particularly big philanthropy, corporate and foundation.
Yes.
Well,
That's a great question.
philanthropy, from my perspective at the community level, was tremendous. That is what we could depend on immediately. There were boots on the ground, not really asking a lot of questions, just really wanting to understand the needs and to get resources to the community, like a NeighborWorks, like the Blue Moon Fund, like Shell Oil, the Kennedy School of Government bringing people. So it was phenomenal. I would say we started to see a reinvestment void right around the 5th year, and really trying to show government and tell government that, hey, we're going right on into a reinvestment void. We need you to kick in and step it up here, because otherwise our work and our efforts are either going to go back, or we can continue to move forward. But it was organizations even like GNOF, the Greater New Orleans Foundation, in which Albert is the president of, that administered many of these grant opportunities to neighborhoods. So that's what we needed immediately in the post-Katrina environment and any post-disaster environment, because government, it takes time. But once government kicked in, it really provided another kind of learning curve. So for example, we started a development corporation that was funded primarily 95% off of philanthropy, private money. Well, that 5th year comes, and it did a 360. It was funded primarily with federal money. So again, you have to adjust in order to manage, and the reporting requirements and things change for nonprofits. And so we just have to be knowledgeable about that.
And that first 5 years, like LaToya said, tremendous influx of support from outside of New Orleans, like we had never seen before. It was really amazing. But then, of course, that starts going away, right? Starts dwindling. And really what started to happen was a pretty amazing transformation to see. Talk about paradigm shifts, paradigm changes as a result of the experience post-Katrina. Our board started taking this responsibility for raising the funds needed to do the work of the organization to a whole different level. I mean, a whole different level. And now it's the way that the last 5 years has evolved for our organization by having the board so committed to bringing in the resources themselves from their own pockets, as well as helping us get the resources that we need to do the work from others. It's just taken us as an organization to levels that previously were undreamed of. So it's really amazing what board leadership can do for organizations to take us to the next level, and we've seen it firsthand.
Ann, did you want to add something to
No,
that?
I think you're doing great.
There was a tremendous outpouring from many national foundations, a lot of individuals from all over the country and all over the world, and we're still very, very deeply grateful for helping, how that helped get the city back on its feet.
I was just going to mention that even in Sunday, in the New York Times, the whole section on giving, and again, Judith Rodin, who's the head of Rockefeller, Rockefeller stepped up to the plate tremendously after Katrina. And even to this day, when she's doing her 100 resilient cities they're talking about New Orleans. So there is interest, and national foundations are, giving to us in new, creative, innovative ways.
I want to respect your time, so I want to thank you for coming today, and please give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you very much.
Right?
We can keep this conversation.
We'll keep it. Hey, come on. What?
Most
you.
didn't exist before Katrina.
Yeah.
Very
So
little.
much. Good, good.
Very
These
little.
are the stars.